There is something deeply comforting about the night. When the world outside goes quiet and the darkness settles softly over everything you know, there is a particular kind of peace that becomes available, one that is hard to find in the noise of daylight hours. And it is in that quiet, in that stillness, that the oldest questions have a way of rising to the surface. Not urgently, not loudly, but gently, like something surfacing from deep water. Who were the people who came before us? Not just a generation ago, not a century ago, but truly before us. So far back that their names have dissolved completely, that their languages have fallen into a silence so total we cannot even guess at the sounds. People who watch the same stars we watch tonight. People who loved and feared and built things they believed would last forever. People who walked their cities in the morning and felt certain of the world beneath their feet. People who did not know that they would end. Tonight, we are going to visit them. Not all of them. There are too many for that. But 6 of them. 6 civilizations that rose to such heights that the echoes of their existence still reach us now, even across the vast silence of centuries and millennia. 6 civilizations that were, in their own time, the pinnacle of human achievement. 6 civilizations that produced art and architecture and knowledge and trade and law and language, that organized the lives of millions, that built things intended to endure. And 6 civilizations that came to an end. We will move slowly tonight. There is no hurry. The night is long and the stories are old. And old stories deserve the kind of attention that only stillness can provide. Each civilization will reveal itself in its own time, and you are invited simply to rest, to breathe, and to let the images form at their own pace. Ruined cities in the sand, temples half swallowed by time, harbors that once sang with the sound of 10,000 voices, now sleeping silently beneath the sea. Forests that once sheltered the fires of people whose names we do not know. Coastlines that the ocean swallowed and kept. By the end, we will arrive at a question that historians and archaeologists and philosophers have been quietly asking for a very long time. A question about cycles, a question about patterns, a question about where we, the civilization of right now, might fit into the long and winding story of human life on this planet. But that question can wait. It will still be there at the end. For now, find a comfortable position. Let your body settle into the surface beneath you. Let your breathing slow, just a little, without forcing it. Let it find its own natural rhythm. Let the tension in your shoulders release, and the tightness in your jaw release, and the restlessness in your hands release. You have nowhere to be tonight except here, and here is exactly where you are. The stars above you tonight are the same stars that look down on everything you're about to hear. They do not change. They are the one constant in this long story. The fixed background against which all of human life is played out, all the building and the burning and the forgetting and the remembering. Let the story begin. The first civilization to consider was one that may never appear in any textbook you have read. It has no agreed upon name. It has no confirmed capital city. It has no alphabet that archaeologists have decoded, no monument that stands clearly above the earth in a form that everyone agrees upon. And yet, the evidence for its existence has been growing for decades, quietly, steadily, persistently, in the work of geologists and marine archaeologists and glaciologists and the custodians of the world's oldest living oral traditions. It has been growing in the data from sonar surveys and in the chemistry of sediment cores and in the patient cross-referencing of ancient stories against the geological record. Piece by piece, a picture has been assembling itself, not yet complete, but not nothing either. To understand this civilization, you need to understand the world as it was a very long time ago. Approximately 20,000 years ago, the Earth was locked in the deepest phase of the last great ice age, the period geologists call the last glacial maximum. The polar ice caps were enormous. Not merely the ice caps we know today, but vastly larger, thick continental ice sheets that covered most of northern Europe, most of Canada, large parts of northern Asia, pressing down from the north in a way that changed everything about the planet's surface. The weight of the ice depressed the land beneath it. The cold altered atmospheric circulation. And so much water was locked into those glaciers, so much of the world's moisture drawn out of the ocean and piled on the land as ice, that sea levels around the world were dramatically lower than they are today. Estimates vary by region and methodology, but in general, the ocean surface during the last glacial maximum sat somewhere between 100 and 130 meters below where it sits right now. 100 to 130 meters. That is not a small difference. That is not a marginal fluctuation. That is a transformation of the world's geography. The continental shelves of the world, those broad, shallow underwater platforms that fringe every continent, sloping gently from the shoreline before dropping away to the deep ocean floor, were largely dry land during this period. They were plains and valleys and river deltas. They were meadows and wetlands and stretches of coast. In the North Sea, the land bridge between Britain and continental Europe, now called Doggerland, was inhabited territory. home to hunter-gatherer communities who fished its rivers and hunted its forests. Between Australia and New Guinea, and the islands now called Indonesia, an enormous supercontinent existed, now called Sahul by researchers who study it. In Southeast Asia, a vast plain connected what are now the islands of the Philippines and Indonesia to the mainland, a region researchers call Sunderland. In the Persian Gulf region, what is today a sea was a river valley. The land that lay where the Arabian Sea now lies was accessible, habitable territory. These were not barren places. This is the point that tends to get lost in popular accounts of prehistoric humanity. Coastal environments are among the most productive ecosystems in the world. They are rich in fish and shellfish and crustaceans and seabirds. Rivers flowing to the sea create fertile floodplains, depositing rich sediments year after year. Estuaries and wetlands teem with edible plant and animal life in concentrations that inland environments rarely match. Coastal people, throughout the history of human settlement, have tended to be among the most well-nourished and productive communities in any region. They have tended to be traders too, because the sea is a road, and coastal communities naturally develop the skills and the technologies to use it. And in a world where sea levels were 100 meters lower than today, the amount of productive coastal land available to human populations was dramatically, astonishingly greater than what exists now. The richest real estate in the prehistoric world is now at the bottom of the ocean. What this means for our understanding of human prehistory is simple but profound. The people who lived during the last ice age were fully modern humans, biologically identical to you, with the same brain size and brain organization, the same capacity for language and abstract thought and social complexity and long-term planning. They were not proto-humans on their way to becoming us. They were us, and they had access to vast stretches of productive coastal land that are today hidden beneath the sea. The places where those people built their settlements, where they buried their dead, where they gathered and traded and argued and celebrated and told their stories to their children. Those places are now underwater. They have been underwater for thousands of years, and for most of the history of modern archaeology, we simply had no way to look at them. That began to change. As underwater archaeology developed as a discipline, and as the technology of deep-sea exploration and sonar mapping improved across the late 20th and early 21st centuries, researchers began to find things on the continental shelves that they did not expect to find. They found submerged riverbeds, ancient channels carved into the seafloor by rivers that had flowed when the land was above water. They found ancient lake beds filled with sediment but recognizable in their forms. They found stone tools scattered across the seafloor in distributions that suggested deliberate human activity rather than natural deposition. And in some places, they found structures, large, organized formations of stone that were very difficult to explain by natural geological processes alone. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kamhat, sonar surveys and dredging operations conducted in the early 2000s revealed what appeared to be an extensive ancient settlement on the seafloor at a depth of about 30 to 40 meters. The sonar images showed geometric structures, walls or foundations, the researchers suggested, arranged across a wide area in patterns inconsistent with natural rock formations. Artifacts recovered from the site, including what were claimed to be worked stone tools and a piece of worked wood, produced radiocarbon dates that some researchers interpreted as placing the site at approximately 9 to 10,000 years old. If this interpretation is correct, it predates the currently accepted timeline for the emergence of sophisticated civilization in South Asia by several thousand years. The site is deeply contested. The methodology of some of the artifact recovery has been criticized, and the interpretation of the sonar images is disputed, but it has not been dismissed entirely, and the debate continues. Off the coast of Japan, in the waters near the southernmost island of the Ryukyu chain, there exists a formation of rock on the seafloor known as the Yonaguni Monument. It is a massive structure of stepped terraces, large flat platforms, sharp right angles, and what appear to be carved channels. Forms that many observers find impossible to attribute entirely to natural geological processes, even though such processes can, under certain conditions, create angular formations in layered rock. Whether the Yonaguni Monument is a human construction, partially modified by humans, or entirely natural is a question that has not been definitively resolved. What is known is that if any human modification occurred at the site, it would have had to take place when the seafloor on which it sits was above water. And the calculations of when that was place the potential human activity at a minimum of several thousand years ago, with some estimates suggesting considerably more. Off the coast of western India, near the city of Dwarka, the legendary city of the god Krishna in Hindu tradition, said to have been swallowed by the sea, underwater surveys have identified submerged stone walls, stone anchors, and other features consistent with a coastal settlement. The local tradition that Dwarka was flooded by the sea appears to correspond, at least in broad outline, to a real event. The structures are there, beneath the water. Their precise age and nature continue to be studied. But perhaps the most powerful evidence for sophisticated human habitation of the now submerged coastlines is not found in underwater archaeology at all. It is found in the oral traditions of the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia have lived on the continent for at least 65,000 years, the oldest continuous culture on Earth. Their oral traditions, their stories, their ceremonial knowledge, their understanding of the land and its history represent a form of accumulated learning of extraordinary depth. These are not simple folktales. They are systems of knowledge maintained through formal transmission, through ceremony, through initiation, through the careful training of those who carry the responsibility of keeping what must be kept. In 2019, a team of researchers from Flinders University in South Australia published a landmark study in the journal Quaternary Science Reviews. Working carefully and respectfully with Aboriginal communities from around the continent, the researchers documented oral traditions that describe the flooding of coastal lands, traditions in which the sea is remembered as having advanced over country that was once dry, swallowing beaches and river mouths and reefs and islands, transforming the shape of the coast from what it once was to what it is today. They identified more than 20 distinct traditions from communities around the Australian coast. Each tradition describes specific coastal features: a bay that was once a valley, an island that was once a hilltop, a reef that was once a freshwater spring, and the seas advance over them. When the researchers cross-referenced these traditions with the scientific record of post-Ice Age sea level rise along the Australian coast, they found that the traditions corresponded with a precision that is extremely difficult to explain as coincidence. The flooding events described matched in geography and in relative timing, the actual history of the sea's advance as documented in the geological record. The oldest of these traditions, the researchers estimated, may describe events that occurred between 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. 12,000 years, oral traditions preserving accurate, geographically specific accounts of environmental changes that occurred 12,000 years ago, held intact across every generation in the intervening time. Transmitted without writing, without libraries, without any of the technological apparatus that literate civilizations use to preserve their knowledge. Transmitted through story, through ceremony, through the deep responsibility that Aboriginal cultures place on those who carry knowledge forward. There is nothing quite like this in the recorded history of any other culture on Earth. The implications of the Flinders University study extend beyond the specific traditions they documented. If Aboriginal oral traditions preserve accurate geographic memory of events 12,000 years ago, then the lands those traditions describe, the dry country that the sea swallowed, were real country that real people knew and named and lived upon. The communities that knew those coastal lands before the sea took them were real communities. They had fires and tools and relationships and language and perhaps architecture. And their physical remains are on the seafloor, in the shallow waters of the Australian continental shelf, where the sea has held them for 10,000 years. Now, carry all of that forward to approximately 12,900 years ago. At that moment, something catastrophic happened to the world. The evidence for this event comes from a striking array of independent sources. Ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet and analyzed at multiple laboratories record a sharp change in chemistry and temperature at a horizon dated to approximately 12,900 years before present. Lake sediment cores from across the northern hemisphere showed changes in the types of pollen preserved, shifts consistent with sudden cooling. Geological strata from multiple continents show, at the same approximate horizon, a thin layer of unusual material, nanodiamonds, tiny diamond crystals that can form under the enormous heat and pressure of a cosmic impact. Microscopic spherules of melted rock and metal, platinum and iridium in anomalous concentrations, charcoal indicating massive simultaneous wildfires across enormous areas. The evidence, accumulated by researchers in fields ranging from glaciology to archaeology to materials science, points toward a catastrophic impact event, a large comet or asteroid, or possibly a fragmented cluster of smaller impacting bodies that struck the Earth at multiple locations with devastating force. The leading hypothesis, called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, proposes that this event triggered the onset of a cold period called the Younger Dryas, which lasted approximately 1,200 years. The name comes from a small alpine flower, Dryas octopetala, a white 8-petaled bloom adapted to cold, rocky environments, whose pollen appears suddenly in abundance in the sediment record of this period, even at lowland sites in Europe where alpine plants had no business growing. The cold pushed south, and the flower followed the cold, blooming in meadows that had been temperate forest. It is a small, almost tender detail in what is otherwise a story of enormous disruption. The mechanism proposed for the cooling involves the disruption of the ocean circulation system. The impact, the hypothesis suggests, destabilized enormous quantities of glacial ice, releasing vast amounts of meltwater into the North Atlantic in a short period. This influx of cold fresh water disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the great system by which warm tropical water flows north along the surface of the Atlantic, releases its heat to the atmosphere, becomes denser and colder and saltier, and sinks to the bottom of the ocean to return south in a deep cold current. This circulation is responsible for a significant portion of the warmth that makes northwestern Europe habitable. When it slows or stops, Europe gets cold very quickly. The Younger Dryas cooling was swift and severe. Temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped by 10 degrees Celsius or more within decades. The cold lasted for approximately 1200 years. The world that existed at the onset of the Younger Dryas, a warming, greening world emerging from the depths of the Ice Age, was replaced rapidly by something much harsher. The consequences for the large animals of North America were terminal. The mammoths and mastodons, the giant ground sloths, the American horses, the American camels, the short-faced bear, the dire wolf, the American lion, the entire community of large mammals that had populated the continent for tens of thousands of years, was gone within a geologically brief window. The debate about what killed them, the impact event, the rapid climate shift, sustained human hunting, or some combination of all three, continues and may never be fully resolved. But the extinctions happened, comprehensively and quickly, in the window around the Younger Dryas onset. An entire fauna, the living world that human beings had walked among for tens of thousands of years, vanished, and the communities living along the rich, low-lying coastal plains that fringe the continents, the flooding of those coastlines was not, in geological terms, an overnight event. Sea levels rose over thousands of years, and the pace was not uniform. There were periods of faster rise, meltwater pulses, episodes when large volumes of glacial ice collapsed and the sea rose by meters in centuries, interspersed with slower periods. But in human terms, across generations, the change was profound and irreversible. Shorelines that people had known in one form became different shorelines. Then shallow waters, then open sea. The fishing grounds moved. The freshwater springs that had seeped through coastal rock went underwater. The middens, the great heaps of shell and bone that mark long-term human occupation of coastal sites, were submerged, many of them preserved in the seafloor sediment, some of them still finding their way into archaeological surveys. The oral traditions of Aboriginal Australians describe this process from the inside. They describe it as a slow advancing, as a country swallowing, as a loss. They describe specific places, a particular bay, a particular reef, a particular river mouth, and how the sea took them over time and did not give them back. The people who remember these traditions do not tell them as abstract history. They tell them as the story of country, of what happened to the land that their ancestors knew. If there was a civilization of sophistication along those now-drowned coastlines, and the evidence increasingly suggests that complex, organized human communities existed there before the sea rose, its physical legacy is sitting on the seafloor, under the sediment, waiting for the technology to find it and the will to look. The carved stones, the house foundations, the hearth sites, the burial grounds, all of it covered by 10 to 12,000 years of ocean. The first civilization is a ghost, but it left traces in the world. It left them in the seafloor sediment, in the statistical anomalies of underwater formations, and most powerfully of all, it left them in the living memory of a culture that has not forgotten what was lost. Tonight, let that image rest in your mind. A coastline lit by a moon just like the one above you tonight, where people once gathered around fires and watched the sea. The sea is dark and enormous and patient, stretching to the horizon. And very, very slowly, so slowly that no single person could see it happening in a lifetime, it is rising. They did not know it would not stop. They believed perhaps that it would stop. It did not stop. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe. The name in Turkish means something like Potbelly Hill. It is an unremarkable name, and for most of modern history, the hill looked unremarkable to match it. A low, rounded rise in the dry rolling landscape of the Şanlıurfa region, scattered with flint chips and the ambient debris of ancient human activity that litters the surface of almost every prominent piece of ground in the Near East. The sort of hill you pass on the road without slowing down. The sort of hill that has been passed on the road for 10,000 years, without anyone stopping to ask what was inside it. In the early 1960s, a joint American and Turkish archaeological survey noted the hill, registered the presence of flint tools on the surface, and observed what appeared to be a Byzantine-era cemetery at one end of the summit. They moved on. The hill kept it secret. The survey was thorough, and the surveyors were competent, and they still missed it entirely. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at Göbekli Tepe. Schmidt had spent his career studying the late Paleolithic and early Neolithic periods of the Near East, the crucial transition window when human societies were beginning, in some places, to shift from mobile hunting and gathering toward more settled ways of life. He was 50 years old. He had a practiced eye for the way prehistoric peoples shaped and placed stone. And when he looked at the flint-scattered surface of the Potbelly Hill, and when he looked at what the Byzantine cemetery had churned up at its edges, he understood immediately that what he was looking at was not Byzantine. He understood that he was looking at something much, much older. And he understood that what was below the surface was significant enough that he needed to begin digging at once and keep digging for as long as it took. Klaus Schmidt spent the rest of his life excavating Göbekli Tepe. He died in 2014, having excavated perhaps 5% of the site. What he found beneath the surface of the hill was this: a series of circular enclosures arranged across the hilltop, each enclosure consisting of massive T-shaped limestone pillars set in concentric rings with two larger central pillars at the heart. The pillars were not small. The central pillars in the larger enclosures stood 5 to 6 meters tall, taller than a double-decker bus, and weighed between 10 and 20 tons each. The surrounding pillars were somewhat smaller but still enormous, still requiring extraordinary effort to quarry and transport and erect. The quarry was nearby, a limestone outcrop on the hillside, perhaps 300 meters from the main excavation site. You can still visit it, and you can still see the evidence of the quarrying work. You can see where the pillars were cut from the bedrock, the marks of the tools that shaped them still visible in the stone. And you can see one pillar that was never finished, one enormous slab of limestone still attached along one side to the bedrock from which it was being separated, that would have weighed approximately 50 tons when complete. The work stopped. Perhaps the stone cracked, or the intent changed, or the people who were cutting it were called away by something more urgent. The unfinished pillar has lain there for 12,000 years, its abandonment preserved as clearly as a stopped clock. The pillars that were completed were transported from the quarry to the enclosures, uphill, across uneven ground, without wheels, without metal tools, without draft animals, ropes and wooden sledges and leverage, and the coordinated effort of many bodies. The labor required was not trivial, organizing enough people to move 20-ton stones, sustaining them through weeks or months of hard physical work, feeding them and housing them, and managing the 1,000 practical problems of a large coordinated construction project. This was not the work of a small, disorganized band of wanderers. This was the work of a society with institutional capacity and economic surplus. And then the pillars were carved. The surfaces of the T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe are covered in relief carvings of animals. Not all pillars, not all surfaces, but throughout the site, and particularly on the central pillars of each enclosure, the stone is alive with carved creatures. Foxes, dozens of them, in various postures, leaping, prowling, watching, vultures with broad, outspread wings, aurochs, the great wild cattle of the ancient world, massive and powerful in profile, wild boars with bristled backs and small, fierce eyes, cranes in flight, their long legs trailing, scorpions rendered in flat relief, serpents writhing along the edges of pillars, spiders, lions, gazelles. The register of species is extraordinary. Researchers have identified more than 30 distinct animals in the carvings of Göbekli Tepe, representing virtually every significant creature of the ecological community that surrounded the site. The quality of the carving is as striking as the variety. These are not tentative scratches made by people still learning to shape stone. They are confident, skilled, deeply observed representations of living animals, representations that demonstrate intimate familiarity with the creatures depicted, long practice in the techniques of stone relief carving, and an artistic tradition already fully developed. The fox that leaps on one pillar surface has the specific angular energy of a real fox in motion. The vulture spreads wings that you can imagine casting a shadow. The boar has weight and bristle and bad temper. Whoever made these had been making things like them for a long time. The tradition from which these carvings came had roots we cannot see. The central pillars, the two large T-shaped forms at the heart of each enclosure, have a quality that the smaller surrounding pillars do not. They have been shaped in some way that is subtle but unmistakable as human figures. The T-shapes have been interpreted as stylized bodies viewed from above, with the horizontal bar of the T representing a head or shoulders. On the surfaces of some central pillars, you can see carved arms extending down the narrow sides of the pillar shaft, bending at the elbows to meet carved hands resting on a carved belt at the pillar's front. Carved loincloths, carved belt buckles, carved fox pelt accessories. The central pillars of Göbekli Tepe are, in some sense, people, enormous stone people standing in the center of the enclosures, facing each other across the interior space, presiding over whatever happened there. What happened there, we do not know. The enclosures appear to have been roofed. Post holes and stone benches around the inner perimeter suggest a covered structure, a building rather than an open circle. The site has produced no evidence of permanent domestic occupation. No hearths arranged for cooking meals, no storage facilities for food reserves, no sleeping areas, no signs of the mundane domestic activity that marks a settlement where people actually lived. What it does produce in abundance is animal bones, the remains of feasts, apparently. Large quantities of gazelle and aurochs and other animals, processed and consumed in large-scale communal meals. The site seems to have been a gathering place, somewhere that people came to periodically from the surrounding region, somewhere they came to eat together and to be in the presence of the stone people, and to do whatever it is that human beings have always done in their sacred places. The orientations of the enclosures appear to carry astronomical meaning. Multiple independent analyses of the site's geometry have identified alignments between the positions of the central pillars and the positions of specific stars and constellations as they appeared in the sky above the site 12,000 years ago. At least one study has proposed an alignment with the star Deneb, the brightest star in the constellation Cygnus, which during this period would have served as a near-pole star, circling close to the north celestial pole and never setting below the horizon. Another analysis has focused on possible alignments with the Pleiades, the star cluster that plays a role in the cosmologies of cultures on every continent. The specifics of these analyses continue to be refined and debated, but the general conclusion that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were paying attention to the sky in organized, intentional ways is difficult to dismiss. The date is what makes all of this so hard to hold in the mind. The oldest layers of the site, excavated at the deepest and most carefully sealed deposits, have been dated to approximately 11,500 to 12,000 years before the present. This places the construction of the earliest enclosures at or slightly before the very beginning of the Neolithic period, the transition from mobile hunter-gatherer life to settled agriculture. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Giza by 7,000 years. It predates the beginning of writing by 6,000 years. It predates the widespread development of pottery. It predates, in fact, most of what we have traditionally called the preconditions for monumental construction. The conventional model of the emergence of civilization had held, for most of the 20th century, that the sequence worked like this. First, hunter-gatherers began to cultivate plants and domesticate animals, becoming farmers. Then, farming settlements grew into villages, which grew into towns, which grew into cities. And only then, once cities existed with their economic surplus and their division of labor and their institutional complexity, did large-scale monumental building become possible. Agriculture first, then society, then monuments. Göbekli Tepe disrupts this sequence at its root. The people who built Göbekli Tepe appear, based on all available evidence, to have been hunter-gatherers. The animal bones at the site are almost entirely wild species. There are no domesticated animals in the record. The plant remains do not show the characteristics of cultivated grain. The site itself shows no signs of the agricultural infrastructure, storage facilities, field systems, irrigation works that would indicate a farming economy. And yet they built this. They quarried and moved and erected 20-ton limestone pillars. They carved them with the images of an entire ecosystem. They sustained the labor force necessary for the work over periods of years or decades. They organized the logistics of feeding large gatherings of people at a site with no local food production. Klaus Schmidt's proposal, that the process ran backward from the conventional model, that the gathering place came before the farming, and in some sense caused it, has become the most discussed idea in Neolithic archaeology. The site required feeding. Feeding the builders and the gathered communities required more food than the immediate surroundings could easily provide. That requirement, he argued, may have been precisely the pressure that drove early experimentation with the cultivation of wild grains. Agriculture, in this reading, was not the cause of Göbekli Tepe. It was the consequence, the response to the logistical demands of a ritual gathering place that already existed. Civilization did not wait for farming. It called farming into being. This is not a settled question. It is an active debate. But Göbekli Tepe has permanently altered the terms of that debate, and the model of human prehistory that existed before Schmidt excavated that hill cannot be restored. And then there is the burial, sometime around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. After the site had been in active use for 2,000 to 3,000 years, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were deliberately filled in, not gradually, through the natural accumulation of windblown soil and debris. Deliberately, purposefully. The fill material was brought in from elsewhere and used to pack the enclosures to the top of the pillars and beyond, burying the carved animals, burying the stone people, burying the stone benches, and the carefully constructed enclosure walls. The animal bones from the feasts went into the fill. The flint tools went into the fill. Everything was packed in together and sealed under the hill. No one knows why. No one knows whether the people who buried Göbekli Tepe were the same people who had been using it, or different people who found it already ancient when they came. No one knows what prompted the decision, whether something had changed about the site's meaning, whether the covering was understood as a completion, or an ending, or a preservation. We do not know what those enclosures meant to the people who used them, and we do not know what the filling meant to the people who filled them. What we know is that they chose to cover it, and that in covering it, they preserved it, kept it from the erosion that has destroyed so many other ancient sites, kept the carvings intact, kept the architecture unbroken, kept the stone people standing in the dark of the hill for 12,000 years, until the man with the archaeologist's eye came to the Potbelly Hill in 1994, and the hill gave it back. Take a quiet moment and hold that image. A hill in Turkey, unremarkable in the afternoon light, its shape no different from the hills around it. And inside, wrapped in cool darkness, the carved foxes and vultures still on the stone faces of pillars that have stood since before farming existed, since before writing existed, since before any of the civilizations you learned about in school, standing in the dark, waiting without knowing they were waiting, preserved without knowing they were being preserved, still there. There is a question that Göbekli Tepe has been putting quietly to researchers ever since Schmidt's first excavation, a question that has only grown more insistent as the site has revealed more of itself. It is not a small question. Why did they do this? Not the practical question of how they moved the stones, or how they fed the workforce, or how they organized the labor. Those questions have partial answers, and the partial answers are impressive enough. The deeper question is the one of motivation. What was sufficient to drive people at the very edge of the Neolithic world, before settled life and before agriculture and before writing, to undertake something of this scale? What did they want badly enough to do this? The answers that researchers have proposed fall broadly into two categories. The first is social, the idea that large communal gatherings serve a function in the maintenance of relationships between dispersed communities. Hunter-gatherer bands typically number somewhere between 20 and 100 people in their immediate social group, but they maintain broader networks of kinship and alliance and trade extending to hundreds or thousands of people, spread across a large territory. Maintaining those networks requires periodic face-to-face contact. Occasions when the distant cousins and the trading partners and the potential spouses come together in a single place, renew their relationships, exchange gifts and information and genes, and return to their own territories. Every human culture has developed some form of this gathering, and every human culture has surrounded those gatherings with ceremony. The ceremony is not decorative, it is functional. It marks the gathering as special, creates a shared emotional experience that binds the gathered people together, and provides a framework for the interactions that the gathering is meant to accomplish. Göbekli Tepe may have been that gathering place for an enormous region, the physical focus for the periodic assembling of communities spread across hundreds of kilometers of Anatolian and northern Levantine territory. The feasting debris scattered through the site supports this. The scale of the construction supports this. The astronomical alignments, if real, support this, a place whose calendar marking function helped communities coordinate the timing of their gatherings from a distance. The second category of answer is what we might call, for want of a better word, sacred. The site was a place of the dead, perhaps, a location where the bones of the important dead were brought and deposited, as has been suggested by finds of carved human skulls and other evidence of a possible ancestor cult at the site. It was a place where the boundary between the human world and whatever lay beyond it was felt to be thin, where rituals were performed that were understood to affect the forces governing the world, the health of the game animals, the fertility of the people, the behavior of the sun and the stars. It was a place, in other words, of worship, or the ancestor of worship, the thing that worship was before the word existed. Both of these answers may be true at once. They are not mutually exclusive. All of the great human gathering places have been simultaneously social and sacred. The market and the temple have always been close to each other, and at their origins they may have been the same thing. The fairground and the religious festival are separated by such a thin membrane that they bleed into each other, in every culture and every century. Göbekli Tepe may be the earliest physical evidence we have of this fundamental human tendency, to designate a place as special, to go there together, to do something there that cannot be done alone. Göbekli Tepe is not alone in its landscape. In the years since Schmidt's work at the main site began to attract attention, archaeologists working in the surrounding region of southeastern Turkey and northern Syria have identified a number of other sites with T-shaped pillars, smaller, less elaborate, but unmistakably part of the same tradition. Karahan Tepe, excavated more intensively in the 2000s and 20s, has revealed not only T-shaped pillars, but also carved human figures of a striking and unsettling naturalism, emerging from the bedrock floor of the enclosures as if growing from the stone, their faces blank, their heads shaved, their chests scored with carved ribs and exposed internal organs in a style that has no parallel at Göbekli Tepe, and that opens new questions about the range of ritual practice in this world. Karahan Tepe has also yielded, in its deepest levels, a room full of stone phalluses set into the floor, 122 of them, arranged in a space that researchers are carefully trying to understand. Whatever this means, it is not something that was done casually or without intent. There is also Tashtepala, the Stone Hills, a regional research program that has identified at least a dozen sites with similar architectural and artistic characteristics across the fertile plains and the forested ridges of what was then a wetter, greener landscape than exists there today. This was not an isolated site, it was a tradition, it was a culture. It extended across a large geographic area and persisted in various forms for thousands of years. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were part of a world that was already sophisticated in its relationship with stone and with ceremony, and that world stretched across a landscape that the subsequent history of the region has largely overwritten. The broader Anatolian world of this period is beginning to look increasingly like a nursery of ideas and practices that spread outward in subsequent millennia to shape the developing civilizations of the ancient Near East. The first domesticated crops, emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, peas, lentils, were all domesticated within a few hundred kilometers of Göbekli Tepe, in roughly the same period that the site was in active use. The first domesticated animals, the dog, the sheep, the goat, the pig, were all domesticated in the same general region within a few thousand years. The village farming communities that began to appear across the Fertile Crescent in the millennia following the construction of Göbekli Tepe. Communities like Çatalhöyük in central Anatolia, with its honeycomb dense mud brick architecture and its walls painted with bulls and hunting scenes, seem, in some ways, to be working out a relationship with the world that Göbekli Tepe was already grappling with. The transition from the Göbekli Tepe world to the world of the farming villages, to the world of the great Mesopotamian cities, to the world of all the civilizations that followed is not a series of sudden breaks. It is a continuous thread, stretching, thickening, fraying, and reweaving, carrying forward certain patterns across all the changes. The impulse to designate a place as sacred, the impulse to gather, the impulse to mark the movements of the stars, the impulse to carve an animal's face into something hard enough to outlast the carver. These impulses did not begin at Göbekli Tepe. They are as old as the human brain. But Göbekli Tepe is the oldest place we have found where they were expressed in a form that has survived to our time. It is the oldest surviving record of human beings doing what human beings have never been able to stop doing, building something together in a place they chose together, and filling it with the images of the world they were trying to understand. That is what the pillar builders left. Not a mystery exactly. Something better than a mystery, a recognition. 12,000 years old and still recognizable. Take that recognition with you as you move forward through this long night. To travel from Göbekli Tepe to the Indus Valley, you must cross 3,000 years as well as hundreds of miles. The civilization of the Indus Valley, known also as the Harappan civilization, after the first of its cities to be excavated, was centered on the fertile floodplain of the Indus River and its tributaries, in the region that is today Pakistan and northwestern India. At its height, between roughly 2600 and 1900 before the Common Era, it was one of the largest civilizations on Earth by the measure of geographic extent, encompassing more than 1 million square kilometers of territory. It supported hundreds of settlements, small towns, larger towns, and at least 2 great cities, Mohenjo-Daro in the south and Harappa in the north. The population at its peak has been estimated by various researchers at between 2 and 5 million people. The higher estimates may be generous. But even the lower ones place the Harappan civilization firmly in the company of ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia as one of the foundational urban civilizations of the ancient world. Unlike Egypt and Mesopotamia, it is almost unknown outside of academic circles. Its name does not appear on the cultural radar of most people in most countries. It has not captured the popular imagination the way Rome or Greece or Egypt has. Partly, this is the result of historical accident. The cultures that shaped European historiography did not encounter the Harappan world directly. Partly, it is the result of the script, a writing system that has never been deciphered, which means the Harappan people have never been able to speak for themselves in a form that later generations could read. The first excavators to dig at Harappa and then at Mohenjo-Daro in the 1920s had no framework in which to place what they found. There had been no anticipation of such a civilization. The accepted history of South Asia at that time began with the Vedic culture, with its Sanskrit texts, its iron-using peoples, its distinctive social organization. What the excavators found was not that. What they found predated that by more than 1,000 years and in many material respects surpassed it. Mohenjo-Daro was laid out on a grid. The streets ran in straight lines, oriented to the cardinal directions, following a rational urban plan that was maintained with consistency across multiple building phases and many centuries. The main streets were wide enough for carts to pass each other. The secondary streets were narrower, leading to individual residential and commercial areas. The plan was not ad hoc. It was designed. The city that resulted from this plan was a place where you could navigate, where the relationship between one part and another was rational and consistent, where the experience of moving through urban space was organized rather than chaotic. Beneath those grid streets, the city had a drainage system, not a simple channel cut into the ground. A system covered drains of carefully fitted brick running beneath the streets, connected to the drainage outlets of individual houses, carrying wastewater and sewage away from the residential areas and out of the city. Manhole-like openings allowed the drains to be accessed and cleaned. The drain system was integrated with the street plan, following the grid, connecting every part of the city to the whole. Individual homes had bathrooms, bathing platforms of smooth waterproofed brick, with drain outlets that connected to the main system. The bathroom drain connected to the house drain, which connected to the street drain, which connected to the city drain. This is municipal infrastructure. Underground, functional, systematically planned municipal sewage infrastructure in a city that was thriving more than 4,500 years ago. It is not a metaphor, and it is not an exaggeration. Mohenjo-Daro had better sanitation infrastructure than most cities in Europe would have for another 4,000 years after its construction. At the elevated citadel area of the city, a structure called the Great Bath stood as one of the most striking monuments of the ancient world. It was a large rectangular pool, approximately 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, and nearly 3 meters deep, lined with precisely fitted brick laid in gypsum mortar and sealed with a layer of natural bitumen to make it watertight. Around the pool was a colonnade, and small rooms opened off the colonnade on at least one side. The pool could be filled and drained. There were inlets and outlets, carefully designed. Whatever it was used for, ritual purification, public bathing, ceremonial bathing associated with the religious or civic life of the city, it was built with an attention to engineering detail that speaks of a culture that took water management seriously, that understood hydraulics and waterproofing at a practical level, that had the institutional capacity to build and maintain complex infrastructure for the benefit of its population. The bricks of Mohenjo-daro were standardized. This point cannot be emphasized enough because what it implies is significant. Across the entire Harappan world, across hundreds of settlements distributed over more than 1 million square kilometers of territory, the bricks used in construction conform to the same set of proportions. The ratio of width to height to length is consistently approximately 1 to 2 to 4, with small variations. This is not the brick size that you would arrive at by independent trial and error in different locations separated by hundreds of kilometers. It is a standard. It was agreed upon at some point by some process, and it was maintained across the entire civilization for centuries. What kind of coordination produces this? Either a central authority with enough reach and power to enforce building standards across an enormous area, or a cultural consensus so deeply embedded and so widely shared that it did not require enforcement, that every brickmaker from the Indus Delta to the foothills of the Himalayas simply knew what proportions a brick should have, the way a craftsperson knows the measures of their trade. Either interpretation speaks to a level of civilizational coherence that is, for the period and the scale, extraordinary. The weights and measures tell the same story. Stone weights have been found at Harappan sites across the full geographic range of the civilization. They conform to a consistent system, a series of values in which each weight is a precise multiple or fraction of the others, in a dual decimal and binary progression that allowed both small and large quantities to be measured with precision. The smallest weights are tiny, some of them barely a gram. The largest are substantial. The system is elegant and practical and clearly designed for use in trade. For weighing out commodities in commercial transactions where both parties needed to trust that the measure being used was the same measure everywhere. This trading infrastructure was not used only locally. The Harappan people traded across the ancient world. Harappan artifacts, distinctive carnelian beads of a brilliant orange red, drilled with a precision that required specialized technology, and distinctively Harappan in style, have been found in the royal tombs at Ur and Sumer. Harappan seals have been found at sites in the Persian Gulf and in Oman. Mesopotamian texts from the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era refer to trade with a distant land called Meluha, which many researchers identify as the Harappan world, and describe the goods that came from it. Carnelian, ivory, timber, lapis lazuli, copper, perhaps textiles. The Harappan world was not a closed, isolated civilization. It was a participant in the ancient world's commercial life, a supplier of valued goods to the great civilizations of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. Cotton, which the Harappan people were among the earliest in the world to cultivate and spin and weave, may have been one of their most important trade goods. The cotton cloth that Mesopotamian texts mention arriving from Meluha, the cotton thread that archaeologists have found traces of at Harappan sites. These suggest a textile industry of significant scale, producing goods valuable enough to travel across the Arabian Sea to the markets of Sumer and Akkad. The Indus script records something of all of this activity. The small carved seals that are the most common inscribed objects of the Harappan world were almost certainly used in trade, pressed into clay to seal containers of goods, to identify their owner or their contents, to serve as the equivalent of a merchant's mark or a shipping label. The unicorn animal that appears on more than half of all inscribed Harappan objects, a creature that looks, in profile, like a single-horned bull, standing with a characteristic posture before what appears to be a ritual stand or offering vessel. Maybe the symbol of a particular trading house or clan, or the emblem of a deity associated with commercial activity, or something else entirely. We do not know. We do not know because the script has not been deciphered. More than a century of serious scholarly effort has produced no consensus on what the Indus script encodes. It is a real writing system. Computational analyses of the statistical distribution of its signs are consistent with a linguistic encoding, with the grammatical structures of a natural language. It is not a simple numerical notation or a purely symbolic system. It encodes language. But whose language and what it says remains unknown. The leading candidate language families are Dravidian, the family that includes Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam. Languages spoken today primarily in southern India, and possibly an early form of a language ancestral to those modern tongues. But candidate does not mean confirmed, and the script remains sealed. What the Harappans said to each other in their streets and their markets and their baths, what prayers they offered in their places of worship, what they called their rivers and their gods and their cities, what stories they told their children about where they came from. We do not know. Their inner world is behind a door that has not been opened, and then, across a period of approximately 2 to 3 centuries centered on about 1900 to 1700 before the Common Era, the civilization contracted and declined, not catastrophically, not with the sudden violence of a conquest. Slowly, city by city, region by region. The great urban centers depopulated. Mohenjo-daro shrank, and then shrank further, and then was abandoned. Harappa similarly. The civic infrastructure that had defined Harappan life, the drainage systems, the standardized building practices, the long-distance trade networks, the literacy, declined and eventually ceased. The script disappeared entirely from the archaeological record. The weights and measures lost their consistency. The population that had once filled the great cities dispersed into smaller, simpler settlements, or moved eastward and southward to regions where rainfall was more reliable. The explanation that has gained the most scientific support in recent decades is climate change, a weakening and southward displacement of the South Asian monsoon system that is documented in the paleoclimate record for the period around and after 2200 before the Common Era. The Harappan agricultural system was built around the monsoon. The Indus River, which watered the fields that fed the cities, was itself dependent on monsoon rainfall over the catchment areas of the Himalayan foothills. When the monsoon weakened and when the summer rains became less reliable, less abundant, more variable, the agricultural productivity that had supported 5 million people began to fail. The Gagahakra River system, a large river or river network that once flowed through what is today the Thar Desert region, supporting an extraordinarily dense constellation of Harappan settlements along its banks, lost much of its flow during this period. Whether this was caused primarily by reduced monsoon rainfall or by tectonic shifts that altered the drainage of the rivers feeding it, or both, the result was the slow drying of a region that had been fertile. The settlements along the Gagahakra, some of the largest and densest in the entire Harappan world, were abandoned. The people moved. They adapted in the ways that people always adapt, by going where conditions were better, by changing what they grew and how they lived, by simplifying their material lives in the ways that simplification sometimes allows survival. The Harappan civilization did not end in a sudden fire. It thinned out, shrank, transformed. The urban complexity that had defined it for centuries dissolved, like a specific form of social organization that requires specific conditions to maintain, and when the conditions changed, the form could no longer hold. Thousands of years later, farmers in the Punjab dug into the ruins and found that the ancient bricks made excellent building material. British railway engineers, surveying a route for the Lahore to Multan line in the 1850s, discovered that the ruins of Harappa were a convenient source of ready-made ballast for the trackbed. They removed bricks by the millions, filling the spaces between railway sleepers with the ruins of one of the great cities of the ancient world, and did not know what they were doing. The people who ran the trains across that ballast in the decades that followed did not know either. A civilization that covered 1 million square kilometers, with a sophisticated writing system and standardized measurements and underground sewers, forgotten so completely that its bricks were used for railway ballast. The darkness is quiet. Somewhere beneath the fields of Pakistan and northern India, the drains of Mohenjo-daro still follow their old routes under the earth. The Great Bath is still there, below the level of the modern ground surface, its bitumen waterproofing still intact, its brick floor still smooth. The unicorn seals are in museums now, the silent text above the unicorn still unread, still carrying whatever message the Harappan people pressed into the clay 4,500 years ago. Still waiting, still saying something no one can yet hear. There is something particular about that silence that deserves to be held a little longer before we move on. Every other civilization in this journey has left us voices. The Sumerians left cuneiform tablets by the hundreds of thousands. Records of trade and law and myth and prayer, the full range of a civilization's verbal output, compressed into fired clay and preserved by the very fires that destroyed the buildings around them. The Egyptians left hieroglyphs carved into temple walls and papyrus manuscripts in royal tombs and administrative records from every pharaonic period. The Hittites left diplomatic correspondence. The Mycenaeans left Linear B. The Romans left an ocean of text, poetry, philosophy, engineering manuals, legal opinions, personal letters, political oratory. Even the builders of Göbekli Tepe left, in the carved surfaces of their pillars, a visual language of symbols and images that researchers are still working to understand. The Harappans left science, on seals and tablets and pottery and ivory and bronze, in a script that is real, that statistical analysis confirms is encoding language with the structural properties of a natural human tongue, but that no one living can read. We have the marks, but not the meanings. We have the map, but not the territory. And because we do not have the territory, the entire inner life of a civilization that lasted, in its urban form for over 700 years, remains closed to us in a way that no other major civilization of the ancient world is closed. What do they call rain? The question is not trivial. When the rains began to fail, sometime after 2200 before the Common Era, the Harappan people must have noticed. A bad monsoon is not invisible. The river levels are lower in the wrong season. The fields are drier, the wells go down, the cattle that drink from the streams are thinner. generation by generation, the pattern that had sustained their grandparents' lives. The reliable summer inundation, the retreating waters leaving behind a layer of fertile silt, the predictable rhythm of wet and dry that allowed a farmer to plan a year, was becoming something they could no longer depend on. They would have had a word for rain. They would have had prayers for rain and rituals for rain, and stories that explained what rain was and where it came from and what it meant when it did not arrive. The unicorn seal might have been associated with rain-calling ceremonies. The Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro might have been a place where the relationship between the city and water was ritually enacted, the city's dependence on a reliable supply acknowledged and appealed to in some formal way. We do not know. We cannot know yet. What we can see in the archaeological record is the physical consequence of rain failing over a long enough period, cities thinning, trade contracting, standardized bricks giving way to cruder construction, the administrative infrastructure of a civilization dissolving back into the landscape it had organized. The slow dissolution of the Harappan world is in some ways harder to reckon with than the violent ends of other civilizations. There was no conquering army, no sack, no fire in the archive room. There was just the rain, becoming less and less reliable across a span of decades and then centuries, and the accumulated pressure of that unreliability on a system that had been built for a wetter world. The decisions that ended the Harappan cities were made in 1,000 households across a generation. To load the cart and go east, to try the lower foothills where the rainfall was still adequate, to leave behind the house whose walls had taken 2 seasons to build. Not one catastrophic decision, a million small ones, each made under the pressure of immediate necessity, each contributing to the larger pattern that was the end of an era. The archaeologists who study this process call it deurbanization. The word is clinical and accurate and completely inadequate to what it actually describes. What it describes is a world of 5 million people, over the course of 2 or 3 centuries, letting go of the form of life that had organized them and finding, or failing to find, new forms adequate to the changed conditions. Some communities survived in reduced and simplified form. Some disappeared entirely from the record. Some appear to have transformed into the later archaeological cultures of the subcontinent, the cemetery age culture of the Upper Indus region, the copper hoard culture further east, cultures that carry certain Harappan material traits into a world that was no longer the Harappan world. This transformation, from one form of civilization into a different, simpler form rather than into extinction, is important to hold alongside the other endings in this journey. Collapse is not always the same as disappearance. The people of the Harappan cities did not vanish. Their descendants are almost certainly among the ancestors of the hundreds of millions of people living today in the regions where the Harappan world flourished. The language that may have been spoken in Mohenjo-daro's streets may be an ancestor of the Dravidian languages spoken today by tens of millions of people in southern India. Tamil and Telugu and Kannada and Malayalam, languages with literary traditions going back well over 2,000 years, languages that are still changing and growing and being spoken by living people right now. If this linguistic connection is real, and it remains hypothesis rather than certainty, then the voice of the Harappan world has not been silent for 4,000 years after all. It has been speaking continuously, changing as all living languages change, carrying forward sounds that were first organized in the cities of the Indus floodplain in a form that the people who organized them would no longer recognize, but that traces a line, however broken and transformed, back to them. The bricks are in museum collections and in the fields, and for a stretch of railway in Pakistan, under the tracks. The drains are under the earth. The script is on 4,000 objects and institutions around the world. And somewhere in the living languages and the living faces of the subcontinent, the people of Mohenjo-daro are still here, still speaking in ways that have been altered beyond recognition by 4,000 years of continuous living. Nothing is ever entirely lost, but not everything's preserved in a form you can find. There is an island in the southern Aegean Sea called Santorini. It is famous today as one of the most photographed places in the world. The images are everywhere. White buildings against a blue sky, churches with blue domes, cliffs dropping hundreds of meters straight down to the extraordinary deep blue of the water below, sunsets that turn the entire western horizon shades of orange and rose and purple. People travel from every country in the world to watch those sunsets. They stay in the cliff edge hotels and drink wine in the evening air and feel, in some inarticulate way, that they are at the edge of something old. They are not wrong about that feeling, though they may not know quite what it is that makes the air there feel so heavy with something old. The caldera they are sitting on the rim of, the great bowl of blue water enclosed by the curved cliffs of the islands, is a wound. It is the scar left by one of the most violent volcanic events in the entire Holocene epoch, the last 12,000 years of geological time. An eruption so enormous that it reshaped the eastern Mediterranean, sent tsunamis racing across the Aegean, buried an island city under meters of volcanic ash, and contributed in ways that are still being measured to the collapse of one of the most remarkable civilizations the Bronze Age world produced. The Minoan civilization was centered on the island of Crete. It was there, over many centuries, that a culture arose which, by the standards of its time, was unlike anything else in the Mediterranean world. It began developing from around 3,500 before the Common Era onward, drawing on the Bronze Age cultures of the Aegean and building from them something distinctive and sophisticated. It reached its full flowering between approximately 1700 and 1450 before the Common Era, a window of perhaps 2.5 centuries during which Minoan culture was at its most complex, its most artistic, its most commercially expansive. The Minoans built palace complexes, not temples, not fortresses, not administrative barracks. Palaces, large, multi-storied, many-roomed structures that were simultaneously administrative centers and religious centers and storage facilities, and ceremonial spaces and residences for the elite, all woven together in an architectural form that has no exact parallel elsewhere in the ancient world. The palaces were built of dressed stone, their walls thick and their construction careful. They had multiple stories, their upper floors reached by staircases of stone or wood. They had interior light wells, open vertical shafts running through the building to bring light and air to inner rooms that would otherwise have been dark. They had elaborate drainage systems, terracotta pipes and stone channels that carried rainwater and wastewater through the buildings and away from them. And at least the palace at Knossos had something more remarkable still, a plumbing system that used tapered clay pipes, fitted together and sealed, to carry water under pressure from a source outside the building to specific points within it, running water in a Bronze Age palace, 3,500 years ago. The art of the Minoan palaces is, by any measure, extraordinary. The frescoes that decorated the walls of Knossos and other palatial sites were painted in the wet plaster technique, colors applied directly to fresh plaster before it dried, locking the pigment into the wall surface in a way that preserved it far better than paint on dry plaster would have. The subjects of these frescoes reveal a culture that was deeply, joyfully engaged with the natural world and the human body. Dolphins lapped through painted waves in brilliant blues and greys, their motion captured with a lightness that no other ancient art tradition quite matched. Monkeys, blue, improbably colored, climbed rocky painted landscapes. A young boy gathered saffron crocuses into a basket. Birds flew against a background of stylized rock. And on the walls of what Arthur Evans, the first excavator of Knossos, called the bull-leaping fresco, perhaps the most iconic image to survive from the entire Minoan world. Young people with lithe, idealized bodies performed extraordinary acrobatics over the backs of charging bulls. The bull-leaping ceremony, if it was a ceremony, was one of the great mysteries of Minoan art. The scenes show a sequence of movement, a figure grasping the horns of a charging bull, a figure horizontal in the air above the bull's back, a figure landing behind the bull. The physical mechanics of this have been analyzed and debated, whether it was a real performed act, whether trained athletes actually vaulted over charging bulls in a ritual context, or whether the image was symbolic, representing something about the relationship between human skill and natural force in Minoan cosmology, is not resolved. What is clear is that the image was central to Minoan symbolic life. It appears across many media and many sites. The bull was everywhere in Minoan culture, in art, in architecture, in ritual vessels shaped as bull heads. Whatever the bull meant to the Minoan people, it was important. The Minoans were seafarers. The evidence for this is everywhere in the archaeological record, in the distribution of Minoan goods around the eastern Mediterranean, in the Minoan-influenced art found at sites far from Crete, in the representations of ships in Minoan art. They were not raiders or warriors primarily. The Minoan world has relatively few representations of warfare or weapons in its art, and no massive defensive fortifications around its palace complexes. This is striking. The great palace at Knossos sat without walls in the middle of its landscape, undefended, which either reflects extraordinary confidence in the security of the surrounding sea, or a social order that did not require the constant expression of military power, or both. What the Minoans built for was commerce and ceremony, not conquest. Their trade routes stretched from Egypt to the Levant to Cyprus to the Greek mainland to the islands of the Aegean. Egyptian New Kingdom paintings at multiple sites show figures that appear to be Minoan traders arriving at Egyptian ports with distinctive Cretan vessels. At Tel el-Dabba in the Nile Delta, the site of the ancient city of Avaris, which served as the capital of the Hyksos rulers of Egypt, frescoes have been found that are painted in the distinctively Minoan style, with bull-leaping scenes and Minoan artistic conventions, suggesting a close relationship between the Minoan world and the Egypt of the mid-second millennium before the Common Era. The reach of Minoan cultural and commercial influence was remarkable. They also had writing, as we have noted. Linear A, the Minoan script, has produced a corpus of several hundred inscriptions, most of them administrative tablets from the palaces, recording the flow of goods and commodities through the palatial storage and redistribution economy. They are short texts, lists, tallies, summaries. But behind the lists are the words of a language, and behind the words of the language is a world of meaning that we cannot access because the decipherment has not come. When that decipherment comes, if it comes, it will be one of the great intellectual events in the history of archaeology. We will hear the Minoan language spoken for the first time in 3,500 years. We will know what they called the dolphin and the bull and the sea. We will know something of what their administration thought was worth recording, which will tell us something of what their civilization thought was worth measuring. We will begin to hear the inner life of a culture that, so far, has spoken to us only through its art, around 1600 before the Common Era. The precise date is a matter of ongoing research and may lie anywhere between 1620 and 1530 BCE. The island of Thera, 110 kilometers north of Crete, erupted. The eruption was catastrophic. The Thera eruption is classified in volcanology as a Plinian supereruption, one of the largest volcanic events that has occurred anywhere on Earth in the past 10,000 years. Its volcanic explosivity index is estimated at 6 or 7, the same scale that places the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 at a 5, and the eruption of Tambora in 1815, the eruption that caused the year without a summer, at a 7. Estimates of the volume of material ejected by the Thera eruption range from about 30 to 100 cubic kilometers of dense rock equivalent. The eruption column likely reached 30 to 40 kilometers into the stratosphere, pumping enormous quantities of ash and sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, where they would have circulated globally and contributed to regional or global cooling for years afterward. The island of Thera was transformed. The central volcanic massif collapsed inward, creating the caldera. What had been a rounded volcanic island became a curved arc of cliffs surrounding a flooded depression, the shape that tourists photograph today. The settlement of Akrotiri, a substantial Minoan town on the southern tip of the island, was buried under meters of volcanic ash and pumice. The ash accumulated layer upon layer, sealing the buildings and their contents beneath a thick, airtight blanket of volcanic material. Akrotiri survived its burial in extraordinary condition. When archaeologists began excavating the site in the 1960s, they found multi-storied buildings still standing to their upper floors, though the floors themselves had collapsed inward. They found frescoes still on the walls, vivid, detailed, brilliantly colored after 3,500 years of burial. They found pottery on the floors, grain jars, storage vessels. A bed preserved as a shape in the hardened ash, the organic material long since decayed, but the outline held. Doorways leading into rooms that had not been entered since before the end of the Bronze Age. Streets between the buildings still navigable, and no people. No human remains, no skeletons, no bodies. The population of Akrotiri had evacuated before the worst of the eruption, probably after a period of preliminary seismic activity that gave them warning. They took their valuables, no gold or silver has been found at the site, and it is not plausible that a prosperous Bronze Age town simply had none. And they left. They walked out of their streets and out of their buildings and down to the harbor and onto ships, and they sailed away from the island that was about to be destroyed. We do not know where they went. We do not know if they survived. We do not know if they arrived somewhere and built new lives, or if they were overwhelmed by the chaos that followed the eruption. They are not identifiable in any subsequent archaeological record. They carried the spring fresco and the flotilla fresco and the blue monkeys in their minds, those vivid painted worlds, and then they stepped into the historical silence that swallows so many people of the ancient world. Hold that image, though, for a moment before it goes. A fleet of ships, small by our standards, deep-hulled Bronze Age vessels with oarsmen and perhaps a single sail, pulling away from the harbor of Akrotiri as the island behind them shakes and the ash begins to fall. The people in those ships have spent days, probably, preparing for this, loading valuables, organizing the evacuation of the town, arguing about whether it was necessary, deciding it was necessary, getting the children and the elderly onto the boats first. The town behind them, which some of them have lived in their entire lives, is still recognizable as itself. The streets are still there, the houses are still standing, the frescoes are still on the walls, the swallows in mid-flight, the lilies not yet buried, the painted seas that look like the real sea they are now on. Where do you go when your island is dying? You go toward the known. You go toward the network of relationships and ports and trading partners that the Minoan commercial world had built over generations. You go to Crete perhaps, or to the Cycladic Islands, or to the coast of the Greek mainland where Minoan traders had maintained contact for a century. You carry with you everything that can be carried. The gold, the silver, the precious objects, the memories, the knowledge of how to build and how to paint and how to navigate by the stars. And you bring the particular thing that no refugee of any era can leave behind, the self that was formed in the place that is now gone, the habits and assumptions and ways of seeing that belonged to the world before. The Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was a world in which maritime refugees were not an unknown quantity. The sea had always been both resource and threat, both road and danger. The Aegean world, in particular, was a world built around islands, around the fact that every island is simultaneously a haven and a trap, a place rich in its isolation and vulnerable in its insularity. The people of Akrotiri were maritime people. They knew how to sail. They had the skills to survive the crossing. Whether they survived what came after, the disruption of their civilization, the absorption into a Mycenaean world that was becoming increasingly dominant, the long process of loss that follows the loss of a homeland, is a question the evidence cannot answer. What the evidence does preserve, in the extraordinary completeness of Akrotiri itself, is a picture of what they had, not the abstract civic statistics of a civilization, population estimates and trade volumes and agricultural yields, but the actual texture of daily life, the size of the rooms, the height of the doorways, the grain in the storage jars, the shape left in the hardened ash where the bed stood. These are not official records or ceremonial objects. They are the residue of ordinary days in an ordinary town, preserved by the same geological violence that ended the ordinary days. Somewhere in those preserved streets is the house of the person who painted the spring fresco. The room where they worked is still there. Its upper story collapsed into the lower room. The fresco fragments recovered and reassembled in the Athenian Museum where they now hang. Whoever painted those swallows, and the quality of the work indicates someone trained in the best traditions of the Minoan artistic world. Someone who had spent years developing the particular skill of painting living creatures in motion with that quality of weightless observed truth. They walked out of Akrotiri with everyone else. They took a boat, they went somewhere. They may have painted again, in some other room, in some other place, with the memory of the spring fresco's room behind them, gone now, under the ash, keeping what they had left behind with more fidelity than the painter themselves could have anticipated. The tsunamis generated by the eruption and the caldera collapse struck the northern coast of Crete with force. Researchers have found pumice deposits and disturbed sediment at heights above the current shoreline at multiple sites on Crete, consistent with tsunami inundation. Coastal settlements on the northern Cretan coast would have been devastated. Ships in harbour would have been destroyed. Fishing communities would have been wiped out. The agricultural land immediately behind the north coast, the most productive land on the island, on the coastal plains that were the island's breadbasket, may have been contaminated by seawater, reducing harvests in the years immediately following the eruption. The Minoan civilization did not collapse immediately after Thera. The palaces continued to function. Life continued in some form for another generation or two, but the eruption seems to have broken something. In the agricultural system, in the trade network that depended on Thera as a stepping stone in the Aegean routes, in the psychological and cultural coherence of a civilization that had just seen one of its major islands obliterated. The disruption compounded, over decades, into a weakness that left the civilization vulnerable. Around 1450 before the Common Era, the Minoan palace complexes on Crete were destroyed and abandoned. All of them except Knossos, which was destroyed and then rebuilt, but rebuilt under Mycenaean occupation. The Linear B tablets from the later Knossos record the palace's administration in Mycenaean Greek. The Minoans had become Mycenaeans, or had been replaced by them, or some complex mixture of both. The distinctly Minoan culture, the undeciphered language, the unfortified palaces, the bull-leaping ceremonies, the dolphins, dissolved into the Mycenaean world and was not preserved as itself. The Minoan people did not disappear. Their genes are in the population of Crete today. Their artistic influence permeated the Mycenaean world, which preserved Minoan craft traditions, Minoan iconography, Minoan design sensibilities in ceramics and fresco. And from the Mycenaean world, these influences flowed into classical Greek culture. The dolphins appear in Greek art, the bull and the labyrinth persist in Greek mythology. The seafaring orientation of Aegean culture carries something of the Minoan spirit forward. The ancient Greeks told stories about Crete. They told the story of King Minos and the labyrinth beneath his palace, of the Minotaur in the dark at its center, of Theseus, who came from Athens to kill the monster, and of Ariadne, who gave him the thread. They told the story of Daedalus and Icarus, the craftsman and his son who tried to fly. The myths cluster around Crete with a density that suggests a real memory behind them, a memory of a real Cretan power that once demanded tribute from the Greek mainland, that housed wonders of craft and architecture, that was associated with the sea and the bull, and strange rituals in deep enclosed spaces. The myths are not history. They are not a reliable record of what actually happened in the Minoan world, but they preserve, in the distorting lens of story told and retold across centuries of oral transmission, some residue of the Minoan reality. The bull was real. The labyrinthine palace was real. The sea power of Crete was real. And the ending was real. Akrotiri continues to be excavated. Every season, new rooms are opened, and new objects emerge from the ash. The spring fresco, white lilies on a rocky landscape, red and pink on white, with swallows in flight above the flowers, was found in a room on the upper story of a building. When the room was opened, the colors were still fresh. Someone painted those swallows and those lilies in the spring of a year, approximately 35 centuries ago, on the plaster of a wall in a city that was about to be buried. They painted them carefully. They stepped back and looked at what they had made. They lived in it for a while, and then the mountain woke up. And they left. There is a letter that was never delivered. It was written around 1185 before the Common Era, in the city of Ugarit on the coast of what is today Syria. The writer was a man named Eshawara. the senior governor of the island of Cyprus, writing in response to a desperate message he'd received from Ugarit. The message from Ugarit, which has not survived but whose content is reconstructible from the reply, described enemy ships at sea, cities being burned along the coast, terrible calamities unfolding. Eshawara's reply, pressed into a clay tablet in the cuneiform script and Akkadian language that served as the diplomatic medium of the Bronze Age world, acknowledged the distress of Ugarit and expressed his helplessness. His soldiers were elsewhere, deployed to other theatres. He had no ships he could send. He was sorry for what was happening. He could not help. The tablet was found in the kiln at Ugarit. It was in the kiln, waiting to be fired, when the city burned. The destruction of Ugarit baked the tablet that described Ugarit's destruction. The fire that killed the people of Ugarit also preserved the words of a man who was sorry he could not save them. The letter was never sent. The city it was addressed to was already burning. And then the city stopped being a city and was not rebuilt, and the tablet lay in the ash of the kiln for 3,200 years. Before we leave Ugarit, it is worth pausing at what the city was, not just at how it ended. Ugarit was a place of extraordinary cosmopolitan richness for its time. Its archives, recovered from multiple palace buildings and private houses, have yielded texts in at least 7 different languages: Ugaritic, Akkadian, Sumerian, Hurrian, Egyptian, Hittite, and Cypro-Minoan. 7 languages in the files of a single city's merchants and diplomats and administrators. The city was not particularly large by the standards of the ancient Near East, perhaps 6,000 to 8,000 people at its height, living in a dense urban fabric of mud brick houses and workshops and temples clustered around the palace complex on its coastal promontory. But its commercial reach was immense, and its cultural reach was proportional to its commerce. The mythological texts found at Ugarit are among the most significant literary discoveries of the 20th century, because the gods and stories they describe bear unmistakable structural similarities to narratives found in the Hebrew Bible: the storm god Baal fighting the sea god Yam, the descent into the underworld, the banquet of the divine assembly. Reading the Ugaritic myths alongside the Psalms and the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible, scholars have found what appear to be common literary traditions, common metaphors, common narrative structures shared between the Canaanite religious world, of which Ugarit was a part, and the emerging religious world of ancient Israel. The great cloud rider of the Psalms, the deity enthroned above the storm, has his distant ancestor in the storm god of the Ugaritic texts. The merchants of Ugarit knew what was happening in the world around them in the years before the collapse. The archived texts from the final decades of the city's life preserve a picture of a prosperous trading community under growing strain. Letters describing disruptions to normal trade routes, correspondence with the Hittite king about economic and political difficulties, requests for military assistance, evidence of social unrest. The people of Ugarit were not oblivious. They could feel the weather changing. They were writing about it, asking for help about it, making practical decisions in response to it. They were also, in all likelihood, still conducting their daily lives with the full texture of normal days. Getting up in the morning, going to the market, arguing with the neighbors about the shared wall between their properties, feeding their children, conducting business, worshipping their gods. The city that the fire took in 1185 BCE was a city full of people doing ordinary things, and the fire did not announce itself in advance as a historical catastrophe. It arrived as fires arrive, quickly, in the night, carried by wind, beyond the power of buckets and blankets to stop. What the kiln preserved, by accident, was the specific voice of one specific man, Eshawara, governor of Cyprus, saying the hardest thing: "I cannot help. I know you needed me. I'm sorry. Whatever arrives, I cannot stop it." The letter has been in the Louvre for decades. It is not on prominent display. It is one object among many thousands, but it is the specific, surviving, three-dimensional voice of the late Bronze Age collapse. The moment when one man picked up his stylus and tried to say the unsayable, in a clay room in Cyprus, to a city that was already going. It had stood on its coastal promontory for centuries, a prosperous trading city where the merchants of Canaan and Cyprus and Aegean Greece and Anatolia and Egypt met and did business, and exchanged ideas and kept their accounts in multiple languages. Ugarit was one of those places that forms naturally at the intersection of trade routes, a city that existed because commerce needed it to exist, and that was destroyed when the commerce that sustained it was disrupted beyond recovery. The destruction of Ugarit in approximately 1185 before the Common Era was not an isolated disaster. It was a single point in one of the most comprehensive civilizational collapses in recorded history, the event that historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse, between approximately 1200 and 1150 before the Common Era. Across a span of 50 years, roughly, nearly every major civilization and political entity in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East either collapsed entirely or suffered catastrophic lasting damage. The process was not simultaneous across all locations. It was more like a cascade, one failure triggering the next, weakness finding weakness across a system so interconnected that the failure of each part increased the vulnerability of all the others. The Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece, the civilization that had controlled the Aegean and much of the Greek mainland for centuries, the civilization of the great fortified palaces, the civilization that Homer's poems remember, collapsed. The palace at Pylos burned around 1180 BCE. The palace at Mycenae was destroyed and depopulated. The palace at Tiryns was damaged. The palace at Thebes was abandoned. The palace at Iolkos on the Thessalian coast, not yet fully excavated but clearly important, declined. The network of Mycenaean palace centers that had organized the economy and politics of the Aegean world ceased to function. The Linear B writing system, which had been used to administer the Mycenaean palace economies, recording the distribution of rations to workers, the inventories of storerooms, the rosters of personnel, the tallies of livestock, disappeared with the palaces that had employed its scribes. Greece entered a period of approximately 400 years, during which no writing was produced anywhere in the Aegean world. The knowledge of writing, which had taken centuries to develop and which had been maintained by the specialist scribes of the palace administration, was not preserved when the palaces fell. The scribes died or were enslaved or simply stopped being scribes because there were no more palaces to employ them. The script they knew, Linear B, that early Greek and its borrowed Bronze Age signs, went with them, 4 centuries. Greece emerged from those 4 centuries with a new alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians of the Levant, and a new way of organizing political life, the polis, the city-state, that was very different from the palace-based political economy it had replaced. And Homer's poems, whenever they were first composed in the form we have them, seem to look back, across those 4 silent centuries, at a world their composer could only imperfectly imagine. The world of the Bronze Age kings, the world of Mycenae and Troy, the world that the collapse had ended. The Hittite Empire, one of the greatest political powers of the ancient world, fell. The Hittites had built an empire that stretched across most of what is today Turkey and into northern Syria, had developed a distinctive legal tradition and diplomatic practice, had maintained a correspondence of equals with the Egyptian pharaohs, had fought Ramesses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, and then negotiated with him a peace treaty that is the oldest known international treaty in history. Its text survives in both Hittite and Egyptian versions. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, in the high Anatolian plateau, was burned and abandoned around 1180 BCE. The empire dissolved. Within a generation, the great Hittite state had ceased to exist. It left behind Neo-Hittite successor kingdoms in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia that preserved aspects of Hittite culture for several more centuries, but the empire itself was gone. In the Levant, the destruction spread from city to city. Ogaret burned. Hazor, a great Canaanite city in what is today northern Israel, one of the most important sites in the Levant, a city that controlled major trade routes through the region, was destroyed by fire and abandoned. Megiddo, whose importance in ancient history gave its name to the concept of a final catastrophic battle, declined sharply. Lachish was burned, Ashdod was damaged. The entire network of cities and towns that had connected the commercial life of the Levant contracted and simplified. The trading networks that had sustained all of this activity, the copper from Cyprus, the tin from Central Asia and Afghanistan, the grain from Egypt, the timber from Lebanon, the tin-bronze weapons and tools that depended on the meeting of copper and tin from sources separated by thousands of miles. Those networks broke down. The ships stopped arriving. The merchants who had maintained the connections between the great palace economies of the Bronze Age world stopped coming because the economies they had served were failing. And when the economies failed, the trade stopped, and when the trade stopped, the economies failed further. The feedback loop of collapse fed itself. Egypt survived, but barely, and in severely diminished form. The new kingdom pharaoh Ramesses III recorded his victories over the Sea Peoples, a coalition or movement of migrating peoples who arrived at the borders of Egypt by land and by sea in the 1170s and 1180s BCE, apparently displaced from their homelands by the collapse spreading across the northern Mediterranean world. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show them arriving not just as raiders, but as migrants, with families, with ox carts, with their household goods. They were not merely attacking Egypt. They were, it appears, trying to find somewhere to go in a world where everywhere they had come from was burning or empty or gone. Egypt defeated them. Egypt kept its borders and its pharaoh and its temples and its administration. But Egypt after Ramesses III was not the Egypt of Ramesses II, or of Thutmosis III, or of the Great New Kingdom centuries. It was a smaller, weaker, more inward-looking Egypt. The empire it had maintained in Canaan and Nubia, and the Levant contracted. The pharaohs who followed Ramesses III were diminished figures, their power eroded by the priests of Amun, and by the economic contraction that followed the collapse of the Bronze Age international order. The new kingdom ended within a few generations, and what followed it was a fragmented, contested, reduced political landscape. The single cause explanations for the late Bronze Age collapse have all been found inadequate. No single thing. Invasion by the Sea Peoples, climate change, internal revolts, economic disruption, earthquakes, epidemics, is sufficient to explain the scale and the comprehensiveness of what happened. The best current understanding, associated with the work of the archaeologist Eric Klein and others, proposes a cascading systems failure, multiple stresses, a severe prolonged drought documented in paleoclimate records from the eastern Mediterranean, disruption of trade routes, movements of peoples, possible epidemic disease, internal social unrest, converging on a civilization system that was, despite its apparent sophistication, fragile in a specific and fatal way. The fragility was the interdependence itself. The late Bronze Age international economy was a tightly coupled system. Its palace economies were highly specialized, dependent on imported raw materials, especially the copper and tin needed for bronze, that came from sources far away, controlled by other political entities, connected by trade routes that could be disrupted. When multiple disruptions hit simultaneously, the drought reducing agricultural surpluses, the trade routes breaking down, the political instability making the management of the remaining resources more difficult, the system that had seemed so robust had no resilience left. It unraveled. At the Palace of Pylos in southwestern Greece, the Linear B tablets from the period immediately before the palace's destruction preserve a record of an administration aware that something catastrophic was coming and trying to prepare for it. Coastal watchers were posted at stations along the shore, watching for enemy ships. Rowers were being conscripted from every available source, mobilized to man the fleet. Metal objects, bronze vessels, presumably from temple treasuries and storerooms, were being collected and brought to the palace, to be melted down and recast as weapons. The administration of Pylos was mobilizing everything it had. The palace burned anyway. The tablets that preserve this record of desperate preparation were baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace, and lay in the ash of what had been the archive room for 3,000 years until archaeologists found them and decoded them. The scribes who wrote those tablets, recording the muster of rowers and the collection of bronze in the weeks or days before the end, are known to us now only as the authors of the last administrative records of Mycenaean civilization. Imagine being one of those scribes, sitting in the archive room of the palace, pressing the familiar signs into clay, recording the practical details of a mobilization you hope will be enough. The sun is at the window. The palace around you is full of the sounds of preparation. You do not know if this will be enough. You do not know that it will not be enough. You record what you are given to record as carefully as you have always recorded it, because this is what you know how to do. And then the fire came. The letter from Ugarit, the one that was never sent, is in the Louvre in Paris. It has been translated, we know what it says, we know the name of the man who wrote it, and we know the name of the city he wrote it to. And we know what happened to that city and to the governor's helpless apology, and to the entire world in which that apology was composed. He could not have known, writing his inadequate letter in the kiln room of Ugarit's administrative palace, that his words would be preserved by the fire he was trying to use to make them legible, that they would outlast the civilization, the empire, the language, the entire cultural world in which they were written. That 32 centuries later, people would read his name and understand his predicament, and feel, across the enormous gulf of time, something that resembles recognition. He was a man in an impossible situation, doing what he could, and knowing it was not enough, apologizing to a city that was burning. He remains, in the clay, in the letter. Across all of that time, somehow he remains. The last of our 6 civilizations is the one whose shadow falls most directly over the world you inhabit tonight. The Western Roman Empire is not mysterious in the way the others are mysterious. Its script is your script. Its language is the root of the language you're hearing right now, and of the languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people around the world. Its legal vocabulary, the concepts of contract, of property, of citizenship, of due process, of rights and obligations, underwrites the legal systems of dozens of modern nations on every continent. Its roads are still visible, some of them still in use. Its poetry is still read, its philosophers are still argued with, and yet it fell. It fell over the course of centuries, and the consequences of its falling reshaped the world so fundamentally that we are still, in some sense, living in the world that resulted. The civilization you inhabit tonight is the civilization that grew from the ruins of Rome, assembled from the pieces Rome left behind, inheriting Rome's alphabet and Rome's law, and Rome's concept of what a city should be, and also inheriting Rome's questions, Rome's unresolved tensions, Rome's failures that became problems for later generations to deal with or avoid. At the height of the Roman Empire, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, the state was by most measures the most powerful and extensive political entity the Western world had ever produced. Its territory stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is today Portugal and Scotland in the west to the upper reaches of the Euphrates River in the east, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the Saharan desert and the first cataracts of the Nile in the south. This was an area of approximately 5 million square kilometers. Within that area lived, by various estimates, between 50 and 70 million people, perhaps 20 to 25% of the entire human population of the world at the time. Those people were connected by roads. The Roman road system was not merely impressive by the standards of its time, it was impressive by any standard. The roads were engineered with a seriousness of purpose that reflected a civilization that understood infrastructure as a source of power. The standard Roman road was a layered construction, a deep foundation trench filled with large flat stones, topped with successive layers of progressively finer aggregate and gravel, finished with a surface of fitted stone paving blocks slightly cambered from the center to drain rainwater to the sides. The construction was expensive and labor-intensive, but it produced a surface that could handle the weight of loaded carts and the passage of marching troops in all weathers, that drained quickly after rain, and that, in the case of the best constructed examples, has lasted 2,000 years. The roads were straight, not because the Romans had some philosophical commitment to straight lines, but because straight roads are faster. A road that takes the shortest path between 2 points allows troops to march faster, messengers to ride faster, commercial traffic to move faster. The Roman legions, on a good road in good conditions, could march 30 kilometers a day. This military mobility, the ability to move forces rapidly across the empire to respond to threats, was one of the fundamental sources of Roman military power, and it depended entirely on the roads. In England, many Roman roads are still visible in the landscape as remarkably straight alignments crossing the countryside, as features on maps, as hedgerow lines, as the underpinnings of modern roads that have followed the Roman course for 2,000 years. In Rome itself, the Appian Way, the Via Appia, is still walkable in its ancient form, the original paving stones still in place, worn smooth by 2 millennia of feet. You can stand on those stones and know that Roman feet stood on them, that the legions that built the empire marched on them, that the merchants and pilgrims and condemned prisoners and triumphant generals of the Roman world passed over these exact stones. The road system was not simply a physical infrastructure, it was an information network. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, used the roads to move official correspondence and official passengers at speeds that the ancient world had never achieved before. Way stations called mansiones were established at intervals along the major routes, approximately 1 day's journey apart, where the official messengers of the imperial government could change horses and rest and eat and continue. The fastest official dispatches could cover perhaps 200 kilometers in a single day, using relays of fresh horses at each mancia. An emperor in Rome could receive a message from a legionary commander on the Rhine, 2,000 kilometers away, within days. The administrative coherence of an empire spanning 5 million square kilometers depended, in significant part, on this capability. Private travelers used the roads too, though not with the official priority of imperial couriers. The itineraries and travelogues that survive from the Roman period give a sense of what long-distance travel along the road network was like. The steady rhythm of the journey, the familiar sequence of towns and way stations, the gradual accumulation of distance measured in milestones, the stone markers set at intervals of 1,000 paces, the Roman millipatium, from which the English word mile derives. Milestones recorded the distance to the nearest major city and the name of the reigning emperor who had maintained or improved the road. They are, in a sense, messages from the imperial government to every traveler. This road was built for you by Rome under the authority of the man whose name you are reading. You are connected to the center. You are part of this. The road network also carried trade. The goods of the Roman world moved along those straight surfaces. Olive oil from Spain and North Africa, wine from Gaul and Italy, grain from Egypt, garum from the fish sauce factories of the Atlantic coast, pottery from the workshops of Gaul and Britain, marble from the quarries of Greece and Asia Minor, silk from the eastern trade routes, glass from the factories of Syria. The economic integration of the empire was not merely a political project. It was a daily reality, experienced every time someone in Britain ate olive oil pressed in Spain, or someone in Egypt drank wine from a Syrian vineyard, or someone in Germany ate from a plate made in a factory in Gaul. The road was what made this possible. The road and the river and the sea together created a commercial zone of a size and coherence that the Western world would not see again for more than 1,000 years after Rome fell. Along those same roads, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the news of the empire's difficulties travelled. The dispatches reporting a defeat on the frontier, the tax collectors whose demands had become impossible, the inflation that made the coins in your hand worth less than they had been when your father was born, the soldiers who passed through town heading north or east with the particular purposeful urgency of men responding to a crisis, and the ones who came back with fewer numbers and a different look in their eyes. The roads carried the good and the bad of empire in equal measure, because roads do not discriminate between the messages they carry. The aqueducts brought water to the cities in quantities that supported urban populations at a density that would not have been possible otherwise. The aqueduct system of the city of Rome alone, at its peak, comprised 11 separate aqueducts delivering a combined flow that has been estimated at more than 1 million cubic meters per day. The water flowed by gravity through channels maintained at a precise downward gradient, sometimes entirely underground through tunnels cut through hillsides, sometimes elevated above valleys on the arched stone bridges that are among the most beautiful structures the Roman world produced. The Pont du Gard in the south of France still stands, a 3-tiered aqueduct bridge crossing the Gardon River. its lowest tier carrying the road, its middle tier providing a walkway, its upper tier carrying the water channel of the Nimes aqueduct. The stones of the upper tier weigh up to 6 tons each, and they were lifted and placed without mortar, held in position by their own weight and the precision of their fitting. The bridge is still standing after 2,000 years because it was built that well. Engineers come from around the world to study it. Roman concrete, and here we return to the mystery that was mentioned briefly before because it deserves to be understood in full, was a technological achievement that modern materials science has only recently begun to understand in sufficient detail to appreciate. The secret was pozzolanic ash. This ash, volcanic in origin, found in deposits around the Bay of Naples near the town of Pozzuoli, has a chemical composition that makes it react differently from ordinary lime-based concrete when mixed with water. When pozzolanic ash, lime, and seawater are combined and allowed to cure, they produce a material that is relatively standard in its initial properties but which continues to evolve chemically over time. As seawater percolates through the concrete in a marine environment, it triggers the growth of crystalline mineral structures, particularly a mineral called tobamorite, within the concrete's microstructure. These crystals fill microscopic cracks and reinforce the material from within, making it progressively stronger over decades and centuries. Modern Portland cement concrete does not do this. In marine environments, modern concrete typically begins to deteriorate within 50 to 100 years, as chloride ions from seawater corrode reinforcing steel and break down the cement matrix. Roman concrete harbour structures built 2,000 years ago are, in many cases, in better structural condition than modern concrete harbours built 50 years ago. This is not legend. This has been documented through physical sampling and materials analysis by research teams in the 21st century. The Roman concrete structures in the harbour of Caesarea Maritima in Israel, the harbour of Cosa in Italy, and other sites have been analysed in detail, and the results confirm the material gets stronger, not weaker, over time. The formula for making this material, the specific volcanic ash, the specific ratios, the specific mixing and curing process, was lost after the decline of the Roman period. The craftspeople who knew how to make it either died without teaching successors or were scattered into a post-Roman world that had neither the economic scale nor the institutional continuity to sustain the practice. The knowledge did not survive in written form in sufficient detail to allow reconstruction, because in the Roman world, practical craft knowledge was transmitted by apprenticeship and practice, not by written manuals. When the practice ended, the knowledge went with it. It took until the early 21st century, and the application of advanced spectroscopic and electron microscopic analysis to surviving samples of Roman marine concrete for researchers to work out the mechanism. The paper was published in 2017. The knowledge was lost for approximately 1,500 years and was recovered by science applied to the material itself. How much else did Rome know that we have not yet recovered? The question is not rhetorical. The contraction of material and institutional complexity that followed the empire's decline was real, and it had real consequences for the transmission of technical knowledge. Skills that had been widely practiced became rare, then were held by only a few specialists, then were lost when those specialists died. The craft knowledge of the Roman world, its metallurgy, its hydraulics, its architecture, its agricultural techniques, was partly preserved in the monasteries and in the surviving elite culture of the post-Roman world, and partly lost in the disruption of a civilization that had held it together. The legal system of Rome was codified in the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, compiled in the 6th century CE under the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian, who sought to preserve and systematize the enormous accumulated body of Roman legal writing that existed by that point. This codification, made in Constantinople when the Western Empire had already been gone for nearly a century, preserved the essential structure of Roman law in a form that could be studied and applied by later generations. It was rediscovered and intensively studied in medieval European universities from the 11th century onward, and became the foundation of the civil law tradition that governs the legal systems of France, Spain, Italy, Germany, and most of the rest of the European continent, and through the colonial history of those nations, the legal systems of Latin America, Quebec, Louisiana, and many other parts of the world. The Roman army was, at its height, one of the most consistently effective military organizations in history. It was effective not because of the individual genius of particular commanders, though Roman history produced many brilliant commanders, but because of its institutional character. Roman soldiers were trained to the same standards, equipped with the same gear, organized in the same tactical formations, governed by the same code of military discipline, whether they were serving on Hadrian's Wall in Britain or on the Euphrates frontier in Syria. This institutional consistency, maintained across centuries and across thousands of kilometers, was a remarkable organizational achievement. It required the sustained transmission of military knowledge, tactics, engineering, logistics, discipline, from one generation of soldiers to the next, across the entire geographic span of the empire. When that institutional continuity broke down, when the professional legionary army was progressively replaced by barbarian foederati under their own commanders, when the military culture of the empire became something different from what it had been, one of the key sources of Roman power was lost. The story of how that breakdown happened is the story of the 3rd century, and it is worth resting with. Between 235 and 284 CE, approximately 50 years, the Roman Empire experienced what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. In that half-century, approximately 26 different men claimed the title of Emperor of Rome. Most of them were military commanders who seized power by force and were killed by force, usually by the soldiers of a rival claimant within months or a few years of taking power. The longest ruling emperor of this period managed about 15 years, most managed far less. The throne changed hands with a frequency that made coherent, long-term administration essentially impossible. The economic consequences were severe. To fund the wars and the armies and the administration, the imperial government progressively debased the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius from its traditional high level to, at the nadir of the crisis, almost nothing. A coin that had once been a reliable store of value became a token with a thin silver wash over a base metal core. When the currency was debased, prices rose. When prices rose, the government needed more revenue. When it extracted more revenue in taxes and requisitions, the economic activity it taxed contracted. The spiral was vicious. Trade contracted across the empire as the political instability and currency debasement made long-distance commercial activity more risky. Urban populations declined in some regions. Agricultural land in some areas went out of production as the tax burden became too heavy to bear, and farmers abandoned their fields. The middle classes that had sustained the civic life of Roman towns, the decuriones, the local elites who funded public buildings and festivals and served in local government, found themselves increasingly squeezed between the demands of the central government and the economic contraction of their communities. The empire recovered under Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century, and then under Constantine in the early 4th. But the recovery was not a restoration. Diocletian's administrative reforms expanded the imperial bureaucracy enormously, creating a more elaborate and expensive governmental apparatus that increased the tax burden. The army was reorganized into a different structure, a border defense force and a mobile reserve, that was more expensive than the old legion-based system and, over time, less cohesive in its institutional culture. Constantine's foundation of Constantinople shifted the empire's center of gravity eastward in ways that ultimately contributed to the divergence of east and west. Climate was a factor, and it deserves more recognition than it has traditionally received in accounts of the Roman decline. The Roman climate optimum, a period of relatively warm, wet, stable climate that broadly coincided with the period of Roman prosperity from roughly the 2nd century BCE to the 3rd or 4th century CE, supported the high agricultural productivity that the large Roman population required. The transition to the cooler, drier, more variable conditions of the late Antique Little Ice Age, beginning in earnest around the 4th and 5th centuries CE, reduced agricultural output in ways that eroded the fiscal foundations of the Western Empire at the same time as its other pressures were mounting. Climate did not cause the fall of Rome, but it made everything else harder. Epidemic disease struck the empire repeatedly, and with catastrophic effect. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 CE, most likely smallpox, making its first large-scale appearance in a population with no prior immunity, swept through the Roman world, killing millions. It killed the co-emperor Lucius Verus. It killed, conservatively, 5 to 10% of the empire's total population, and significantly higher percentages in the densely packed cities and military camps, where it could spread most freely. The plague of Cyprian, beginning around 249 CE, is recorded by contemporary sources as killing 5,000 people per day in Rome at its height. Whether this is accurate or an exaggeration, the epidemic was real, and its effects on the military capacity and civic functioning of the empire were severe. The peoples beyond the frontier pressed with increasing force through the 3rd and 4th centuries. The Goths, the Franks, the Alemanni, the Burgundians, Germanic peoples who had lived along Rome's borders for centuries, who had served in Roman armies and absorbed Roman cultural influence, who were themselves being pushed westward by the Huns arriving from the Central Asian steppes, found the borders increasingly permeable as the empire's military and political coherence declined. Rome's response was, of necessity, to negotiate. The foederati system, the formal incorporation of barbarian military contingents under their own commanders, fighting for Rome in exchange for payment and land grants, became increasingly central to Roman military capacity, at the cost of the institutional coherence that had defined the Roman army at its height. In 410 CE, the Visigoth leader Alaric led his forces into Rome and sacked it. The sack lasted 3 days. It was not a total destruction. Most buildings survived, and the papacy and the major churches were respected as sanctuaries. But it was a sack. Rome had not been taken by external enemies in 800 years. The Gallic sack of 390 BCE was the last comparable event, and it had receded into the semi-mythological past. Now, Rome was sacked again, by the people who were supposed to be guarding it. The psychological shock was immense and lasted. St. Augustine began writing The City of God within 2 years of the sack, the great theological work that distinguished the earthly city from the divine one, that argued Rome's fall was not a refutation of Christianity, but a demonstration of the impermanence of all earthly things. The eternal city, it turned out, was not eternal. Augustine's response was to redefine what was eternal, but the wound that required that response was real. The last Western Roman emperor, deposed in 476 CE, was a boy of perhaps 15 or 16. His name was Romulus Augustulus. Romulus, the name of Rome's legendary founder, and Augustulus, the diminutive of Augustus, the title of the first emperor. Little Augustus. The very name seems designed to emphasize what was being lost, the beginning and the foundation of everything, compressed into a diminutive, in the person of a child. The Germanic military commander Odoacer, who deposed him, did not take the imperial title. He sent the Western imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as a king. The imperial pretense was over. The centuries that followed the fall of the Western Empire were not simply dark. They had their own creativity, their own beauty, their own intellectual and artistic achievements. The illuminated manuscripts of the Irish monasteries, the architecture of the Carolingian period, the gradual emergence of the medieval world. But in many material respects, the post-Roman West was significantly poorer, less urbanized, less literate, less technologically capable, and less commercially integrated than the empire it replaced. The population of the city of Rome itself declined from perhaps 1 million people at the height of the empire to perhaps 20 or 30,000 in the early medieval period. People lived among ruins they could not replicate or fully understand. The Pantheon stood because it became a church. The Colosseum was quarried for building material. Its travertine marble stripped away over centuries for new construction projects, the holes where the iron clamps had been left as a permanent record of the plunder. The great aqueducts were maintained only partially, then fell into disrepair and silence. The roads remained because roads are hard to erase, and the straight alignments of Roman roads continued to shape European geography and travel for centuries, their course preserved in the paths that people took because people before them had taken them. Latin fragmented. In Gaul, the Latin of Roman administration and commerce, mixing with the local Celtic languages and later the Germanic languages of the Frankish invaders, became, over centuries, Old French. In Iberia, it became the ancestors of Spanish and Portuguese and Catalan. In the Italian peninsula, it became Italian. In the Danubian provinces, it became Romanian. These are not simply dialects of Latin. They are new languages, each with its own grammar, its own phonology, its own literary tradition. But they carry Latin inside them, the way a river carries the memory of the mountain it came from, the shape of the valley it carved on its way to the sea. In the monasteries of the early medieval world, Ireland and Northumbria, the Loire Valley, and the Italian peninsula, the great scriptoria where monks copied text by hand across the long evenings of the early Middle Ages, the inheritance of Rome was preserved in the form of manuscripts. Virgil and Cicero and Ovid and Augustine, the Gospels and the Church Fathers, fragments of Aristotle and Plato in Latin translation. The knowledge waited in those manuscript rooms, in the cool dark of the cloister, as Göbekli Tepe had waited in the cool dark of the hill, as the tablets of Pylos had waited in the ash of the archive room, waiting for the world to be ready. When the Renaissance began to coalesce in the cities of northern Italy in the 14th and 15th centuries, the manuscripts were there. The Greek texts that had been preserved in Constantinople, the Platonic dialogues, the Aristotelian corpus, the Greek historians and mathematicians and physicians, began arriving in Italy as the Eastern Roman Empire came under increasing pressure from the Ottoman Turks. They arrived in the hands of Greek scholars who brought them west, and they were received by Italian humanists who were already hungry for them, who had been slowly rediscovering from the manuscripts in their own monastery libraries the outline of the intellectual world Rome had inherited from Greece. The civilization that came out of the Renaissance, that flowered through the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and into the interconnected global world of today, was built in large part on the knowledge that survived the fall of Rome. It grew from what the monks preserved, from what the Greek scholars carried west, from what the legal scholars rediscovered in the Corpus Juris Civilis, from what the architects and engineers found when they looked carefully at the ruins of the ancient world and asked how it had been built. Rome fell, and everything that came after it grew from the root it left behind. Now we arrive at the question. You have traveled far tonight. You have stood at the edge of a coastline 12,000 years old, and watched the patient sea take what people built there. You have walked between the stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe in the darkness before agriculture, and tried to understand what the people who raised them were reaching toward. You have walked the grid streets of Mohenjo-daro, and touched the standardized bricks, and contemplated the silence of a script that speaks to no one living. You have looked at dolphins leaping in vivid paint on the wall of a palace in Crete, and tried to feel what the people who painted them felt when they stepped back, and looked at what they had made. You have read the letter in the kiln at Ugarit, the one that was never sent to the king already dead. You have stood in Rome and felt, in the marble and the wide roads and the flowing aqueducts, the presence of something that genuinely believed it would last. 6 civilizations, 6 endings. The question is, are we the 7th? It deserves to be held gently, this question. It is not an invitation to panic, and it is not a prophecy, and it is not the cynical conclusion of a nihilistic argument about the inevitability of collapse. History is not a wheel that turns with mechanical necessity, each civilization destined to rise and fall in its appointed season, regardless of what its people do. The pattern, such as it is not deterministic. It has not been fixed in advance. It remains open. Each of the 6 civilizations we have visited tonight ended differently. Some were struck by forces largely or entirely outside their control. The comet that may have triggered the Younger Dryas was not the fault of the coastal civilizations it drowned. The eruption of Thera was not caused by any failure of Minoan policy or Minoan character. Some were eroded by climate shifts that they did not cause and that their understanding of the world did not equip them to anticipate. Some played a significant role in their own difficulties. The Roman debasement of the currency, the Roman overextension of the military frontier, the institutional failures that made adaptation progressively harder. The late Bronze Age collapse involved, it seems, all of these at once: climate and disruption and migration and political failure, and the cascading logic of interconnected systems under simultaneous stress, and none of them knew they were ending in time to change course. This is perhaps the most important thing to hold from tonight's journey. Not the scale of the collapses, not the specific mechanisms of failure, but the simple fact of not knowing. The administrators of the Harappan cities did not know that the monsoon was beginning a multi-century decline. They knew that the rains had been poor this year and the year before, and perhaps for several years running. But the pattern, the long, slow, irreversible withdrawal of the seasonal rainfall that their entire civilization depended on, was invisible to them in its full scope. They could not see far enough, could not measure the right things, did not have the conceptual vocabulary to understand what was happening to them. The scribes of Pylos did not know that the entire late Bronze Age international system was collapsing simultaneously, from the Aegean to the Levant to the Hittite plateau. They knew that enemy ships had been sighted on the coast. They knew that the palace treasury was strained. They knew that their orders to mobilize rowers and collect metal for weapons were urgent. But the systemic nature of what was happening, the interconnected simultaneous failure of every part of the world they knew, was beyond their ability to perceive. They could see what was in front of them. They could not see the whole. We, in this respect, are different. We have the letter from Ugarit. We have the tablets from Pylos. We have the paleoclimate data from lake sediments and ice cores and cave formations, telling us in chemical and physical detail the story of the climate changes that accompanied every major civilizational crisis in the past 12,000 years. We have the genetic data of ancient populations, tracking the migrations of people displaced by collapsing systems. We have the archaeology of the submerged coastlines, slowly revealing what the sea took 12,000 years ago. We have the study of the late Bronze Age collapse and the Harappan decline and the Roman crisis, all in extraordinary detail, all analyzed by brilliant researchers who have spent their careers trying to understand what went wrong and why. We have, in other words, a detailed, scientific, evidence-based understanding of the failure modes of complex civilizations. This understanding is not complete. It is never complete, and new findings continue to revise what we think we know. But it is vastly more than anything any previous civilization had access to. It is not nothing. It is, in fact, an extraordinary inheritance. We also know things about our own civilization that are directly relevant to the lessons of the past. We know that our climate is changing, that the direction and pace of that change is shaped significantly by the industrial activity of our civilization, and that the consequences for sea levels, for agricultural systems, for freshwater availability, for the frequency and severity of extreme weather events, are being measured and modeled by the best scientific minds in the world. We know that our global supply chains and our financial systems and our communication networks are deeply, tightly interconnected, and that the failure of any one part can cascade through the whole in ways that are difficult to predict and hard to stop once started. We know that the gap between the rate of change in the world and the capacity of our institutions to manage that change is real and growing. We know all of this. We know it because we have built the tools to see it, because we have developed the sciences that allow measurement at scale, because we have the communication technologies that allow what is known in one place to reach everywhere else in moments. The researchers who study civilizational collapse, and the scientists who study climate, and the economists who study systemic financial risk are all, in their own ways, trying to give us the knowledge that Pylos and the Harappan cities in Ugarit did not have. Knowledge of what is coming, early enough to do something about it. Whether we act on what we know, generously enough, quickly enough, at a scale sufficient to matter, is the question that is being answered right now in the present tense by everything that our civilization does and fails to do. History cannot answer it for us. It can only say they did not know, and they ended. We know, the rest is up to us. There is one more thing worth holding before the night grows too deep for words. Every civilization we have visited tonight produced people of extraordinary intelligence and capability. The architects who designed the drainage systems of Mohenjo-Daro, working in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era with no modern materials or computational tools, designed infrastructure that functioned for centuries. The artists who painted the spring fresco at Akrotiri, the swallows and the lilies on the white plaster, achieved a quality of observed naturalistic beauty that required years of training and a tradition of practice already fully developed. The engineers who built the Pont du Gard solved structural and hydraulic problems of significant complexity without electronic calculation or modern materials theory. The Roman concrete makers understood, in practice, a marine chemistry that took modern science centuries to rediscover. These were not primitive people. They were not simpler versions of us, proto-humans on the way to becoming something better. They were us, exactly us, with the same capacity for intelligence and creativity and compassion and fear and love and ambition, living in different material circumstances with different tools and different knowledge. Their achievements were real achievements, made by real minds working at the full extent of what those minds could do, and they solved hard problems. The Harappan civilization maintained a standardized measurement system across more than 1 million square kilometers without modern communications. The Roman Empire administered 5 million square kilometers of territory with functional legal consistency. The Aboriginal custodians of Australia maintained accurate geographic memory across 12,000 years of oral transmission. The people of Göbekli Tepe coordinated the labor of hundreds of people to build something so large and so deliberate that it still imposes itself on the imagination after 12 millennia. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe, who chose to fill in those stone circles, to cover the carved animals and the towering pillar people, to let the hill reclaim what had been raised from it, made a decision we cannot explain. But it was a deliberate decision, not an accident. It required sustained collective effort. And whatever they intended, completion, preservation, transformation, ending, the act of burying the site preserved it intact through 12,000 years, until the hill was ready to give it back. Things that end are not always gone. The Indus script is silent, but it exists on 4,000 objects in museums around the world. Someday, a key may be found, a bilingual inscription, a computational breakthrough, a new discovery that provides the context needed for decipherment, and the voices of the Harappan people will speak for the first time in more than 3,000 years. 5,000 years of silence ending in a sentence about a river, or a trade, or a prayer. The submerged coastlines are there, in the shallow continental shelves, holding what the water covered. The seafloor is patient. It keeps what the sea takes, and eventually the technology to look at it properly arrives. And what was hidden becomes visible again. What was lost is not always lost forever. What the sea took, it also kept. The Aboriginal oral traditions of Australia preserved accurate memory of the world before the sea rose for 12,000 years, through every disruption and every season and every generation. They did not know that scientists would one day confirm the accuracy of what they remembered. They were simply carrying the truth forward, in the form their culture had developed for carrying truth. The form was story, the story was true, and the truth survived. The letter from Ugarit, the one written to a king already dead, is in a museum in Paris. 3,200 years after the kiln it rested and burnt down. The man who wrote it, Eshwara, governor of Cyprus, sorry he could not help, has been dead for 32 centuries. The city he wrote to has been dust and archaeological strata for 32 centuries. And yet the letter remains, the words remain, the apology remains. He was a man doing what he could in a situation he could not resolve. He sat down, and he picked up the stylus, and he pressed it into the clay, and he said the honest, inadequate things that the situation called for. He sealed the tablet and sent it to the kiln, and did not know that the kiln would become the archive of the most terrible moment of his civilization. He remains in the fragment of clay, across all of that time. You are the 7th civilization. You are here and you are aware, and you carry everything. You carry the carved animals of Göbekli Tepe in your blood, the long line of human beings who stood in enclosures and looked at stone faces and felt something that was not yet religion and not yet art, but was the ancestor of both. You carry the Harappan bricklayer who laid the drain outside the house in Mohenjo-Daro, fitting the covered channel into the street system, doing careful work on a quiet morning 4,500 years ago. You carry the artist who painted the dolphins on the wall in Knossos, who mixed the blue pigment to a shade that matched the sea outside the palace windows, who made something beautiful in the knowledge that it would be seen and felt and carry meaning. You carry the scribe at Pylos, who pressed the stylus into the clay in the last days, recording what he had been given to record. You carry the governor of Cyprus, sorry for everything he could not give. You carry the engineers who built the Pont du Gard and the aqueducts of Rome, who understood water and stone and gravity and time. You carry all of them. They are in your language, in your calendar, in your very concept of what a city should provide to its people. They are in the questions you ask at night, in the dark, when the world is quiet, and the oldest thoughts rise to the surface. Who are the people who came before us? Now you know some of them. They were builders and traders and artists and administrators and sailors and scribes. They were people who loved their cities and their fields and their children and their stories. They were people who built things intended to last forever and watched them end. There were people who did not know what was coming, in most cases, until it was already there. We know more than they knew. We know about the failure modes of complex civilizations. We know about the fragility of interconnected systems. We know about the way climate can shift and not come back. We know about the way knowledge can be lost when the institutions that hold it collapse, and about the long, slow labor of recovering what is lost. We know all of this, and we are here, in the night, inheriting it. The question of what we do with what we know, that is the story of the century we are in the middle of. It is being written now, in decisions and policies and habits and technologies and stories, by everyone alive on this planet tonight. Every person who goes to sleep in the knowledge that the world they wake into will require something of them. Every person who carries, in their own way, the responsibility of continuity. You are one of those people, but not tonight. Tonight, the only requirement is rest. The stone pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand in the dark of the hill, patient as they have always been. The spring fresco in Akrotiri is still bright, the swallows still in flight, the lilies still in bloom. The drains of Mohenjo-Daro follow their old roots under the earth. The letter from Ugarit waits in its museum in Paris. Already read, the apology already received, the dead king somewhere beyond the reach of news. And the stars are there. They were there before any of this. Before Göbekli Tepe, and before the Indus Valley cities, and before Knossos, and before the Bronze Age world that burned, and before Rome that fell, and before the night that the sea rose over the old coastal plains, and the fires went out one by one under the water. They will be there after all of this. Let your breathing slow. Let the images of the night settle into the quiet dark at the back of your mind. The pillar builders, the seal cutters, the fresco painters, the scribes and governors and engineers and sailors and farmers and priests. All of them real. All of them gone. All of them somehow still here, in the things they made and the words they left and the long chain of human life that runs from them to you without breaking. You carry all of them. Rest now. The stars are keeping watch.